that's the next slide. So we have then natural disasters, even though I would argue, going back, that poor risk management oftentimes facilitates natural disasters. Yes, there are hurricanes, but then also climate change, stuff going on. Natural disasters, obviously. So they talk about earthquakes and all that type of stuff, tropical storms, hurricanes. So yeah, there we go. Disease outbreaks, even though sometimes those are hyperbolic. We think, ooh, Ebola, we're all gonna die. So in any case, yeah, disease outbreaks are examples. We got the Bluebell stuff going crazy, and the Chipotle stuff, lots of stuff. I just saw on the news today, Chipotle wants us to come back. I have never eaten at a Chipotle. The next type is unforeseeable technical interactions. Unforeseeable. Many of the manufacturers that lead to crisis are a result of unforeseeable technical interactions. In the classic text Normal Accidents, Charles Perrow, in 1999, describes dozens of examples of organizations whose monitoring and safety equipment became inaccurate and inoperable because of a series of seemingly unrelated errors and equipment failures. For example, he describes how a commercial aircraft was forced to crash land after a coffee maker shorted out, causing an electrical fire in a series of wires and disabling other safety equipment and vital control systems. This is why I do not order coffee when I'm flying. And then they have product failure as another unintentional crisis. We see the stuff right now with the hoverboards. And there's also, if you might want to take a look at this, but if you have kids, you might want to take a look at this organization. Maybe I'll put this as a bookmark as well. I haven't yet, but Safe Kids Worldwide, www.safekids.org, monitor and list product recalls of all types for parents. By checking websites like this, one can see the varied and numerous product recalls that affect organizations and children across the world. But sometimes, people, I'm talking about how companies or whatever will sort of, sometimes the unintentional ain't so unintentional. We're just trying to save a buck. But in any case, so the last thing is downturns in the economy, which again, unintentional. Sometimes the policies will create downturns in the economy. It says even organizations that are ethical, thoughtful in their planning, and strict in their maintenance of safety regulations can be victims of economic crisis. So yeah, anytime there's an economic crisis, it can certainly impact the organization. Folks have, companies have stuff that's invested. If stocks go down, things get screwed up. So Columbia College dealt with this when we had, a lot of our endowment, and when during the financial crises of a while back, it really impacted the level of our endowment. But in any case, so we've got examples or types of intentional and unintentional crises. And so also remember, so as you're thinking about your application project, the big project at the end of the semester, and when you're thinking about selecting things, and I would, if I were you, try to do so pretty quickly. Try to pick a crisis. Of course, who knows? Something. I'm sure that there's going to be some huge, big crisis, something that happens over the course of the semester that you might want to pick as well. But so your opportunities here are terrorist attacks that you view as a crisis, sabotage, workplace violence, poor employee relationships, poor risk management, hostile takeovers, unethical leadership, natural disasters, disease outbreaks, unforeseeable technical interactions, product failure, downturns in the economy. All these become sort of examples of types of crises that you could pick for your project. The next section, and therefore the next slide. I already already said a few things about it. The next slide actually says, read the ICM report. I'll say just a few things about it. I already did. And the next one then is just a picture. You can see that. Ooh, look. He's got the whole world in his hands. And the significance of crisis in a global environment. I am not God. Or Jesus. Or Trump. By the way, watch the debate tonight. I might. I don't know if I have the courage. Or the commitment, or the confidence of the confidence. So basically it just says that there's so many new crises, and crises are becoming, ironically, routine. We cannot prevent them, and as consumers we cannot avoid them. And we see lots of different types of crises that we didn't see, a while back, 20 or 30 years ago, in part because of technology, and in part because we are becoming much more of a global environment. So things that might happen in China impact us. Think about just the recent stuff going on with the stocks, and what happens globally. Way over there is going to impact us here in Colombia. So that's just a little comment they have there about how we live in a complex world. The little last part of that section, I think, is pretty important. As our world becomes, as the world turns, more complex, interconnected, centralized, and efficient, the frequency and forms of crises will steadily increase. Understanding how to effectively engage in crisis communication then is a skill ever increasing in value. To be effective, one must be able to recognize and resist the varied misconceptions associated with effective crisis communication. That's actually an excellent transition statement to the next section. But basically the argument is, again, they're also sort of saying why this, studying this stuff is very, very important. More complex world, we're going to have more crises and different types of crises, so you got to know how to deal with it. And then the final section, and table 1-2, as I said, is super cool. Is just sort of misconceptions of crisis communication, and I like these. These are really pretty good. I think some are more important than others, but on the slide that you cannot see, here's Yoda again. Can you see Yoda? Here are some misconceptions. I can't do Yoda. Okay, I'm sorry. Here are some misconceptions. Crisis build character. No. If anything, what crises do exposes bad character. It exposes the established character, but we can work from that. So it's not like it is, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. What they're saying here is that a crisis in an organization actually shows perhaps flaws that you've had. But the next thing they say is a misconception is crises do not have any positive value. Again, there are opportunities to grow. There's a really great example of Greensburg, Kansas, that completely renewed their entire community after a tornado. The third misconception is that the third misconception about crisis is that resolution to a crisis solely involves retrospectively determining fault, assigning blame, and investigating what happened. No. So they say it's not just about determining responsibility and blame, and this is really, really important to me. And that is that, and a lot of people do this, it's just like, what happened, who's at fault, let's go scapegoat people, bad, 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 bad. One of the things I really thought, actually, the example from the FedEx dude was pretty good, because it talked about how, he could have just said that dude was terrible and we fired him. But no, he talked about how they're renewing the organization, looking at me. It was really a good response. So take a look at that if you haven't. But basically what they say is it's not just about sort of blaming somebody and figure out what the causes were. It says crisis leadership and effective crisis communication involves creating a vision for moving beyond the crisis, learning and creating meaning. So it's not just about the investigation process. And it says effective crisis communication should not get mired down in the investigation process, but rather, again, offer a vision for a renewal, a new organizational sort of ethos. So that's really important, I think. The fourth misconception here is that crisis communication is solely about getting information out to stakeholders, and there's some other chapters that talk about the stakeholders, all the people that might be impacted by the crisis. And basically, they say that that's sort of bad. You can't have like one scripted message that you send out to everybody. Everything is always contextual. You've learned this in comm 100. That what you might say to this audience is something different than you might say to this audience, because you have to reach them differently. You got to send different messages to folks who might have stock, real stock, STOCK, in your company versus the people that are suffering in some sort of poor neighborhood because your company did something stupid. But in any case, so it talks about that type of stuff and how clearly organizations work with stakeholders to consider risk before a crisis and develop a crisis needs assessment, blah, 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 blah. However, crises are dynamic and by definition a surprise to most all the people impacted by the event. This is important, the best crisis messages, and this is on page 17, in this book come from leaders who responded to a crisis authentically based on laudable values and what they believed was in the best interest of their stakeholders. In each case, they met regularly with stakeholders to hear their concerns. The fifth misconception, crisis communication involves taking a rigid and defensive stance. That's bad. Don't do that. Folks have to be flexible, have to be agile. We live in a crisis, it creates uncertainty. So we can't just stick to our guns, stick to the rules, be defensive. We got to be very, very flexible. It gives a really good idea or example of Rudy Giuliani post 9/11. He frequently had press briefings. He didn't have all the answers, but he was engaged and agile and effective in his response to crisis. So don't be rigid, don't be defensive. Be flexible and agile, because you really don't know what's going on in a lot of situations. 6, crisis communication is about enhancing elaborate prefabricated crisis plans. It's about enacting elaborate prefabricated crisis plans. No, that's a misconception. They say here, you can have a crisis plan in place, but that's not always going to work. And I love this. This is important. I put a little star by this paragraph. This is, again, on page 17 at the very bottom. Although crisis plans can be helpful in preparing for a crisis, the best predictor of effective crisis management is strong, positive stakeholder relationships. As you read the cases in this book, pay special attention to how many effective organizations relied on stakeholders to support them during a crisis. For this reason, organizations looking to prepare for crises should work with their stakeholders to establish strong, positive relationships with them. We recommend that organizations work through problems and concerns before a crisis happens, blah, blah, blah. Organizations that spend time establishing these relationships are better able to respond to the needs of those groups following a crisis. So maybe reach out to folks who live in flood areas and create and establish really strong bonds and relationships before a flood happens. But in any case, so that's a pretty good and important one. The next one, crisis communication, is about over-reassuring the public about the impact of the crisis to avoid panic. Again, that's bad. You can't say, oh, it's just a little oil spill. That's bad. Don't over-reassure. I mean, you don't want panic, I suppose, but you have to be honest with folks. Folks